Welcome to Reason for Truth. I'm your host, Stephen Garofalo. Welcome to another episode. Listen, God is never silent. It's just that we are often not listening. Listen, I'm actually pre-recording this, supposed to do a talk tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. men's breakfast. And I tell you what, got expected some ice. I don't know if we're going to be there. Either way, there's some people that can't make it there for various reasons. So I'm going to pre-record this in light of that talk. Also, you can go back and listen to it. Listen, the year 2020 was a very long year. Many of us have been panicking, and listen, even as Christians, we're worried. A screaming economy came to an abrupt stop for over a year. People locked down in their houses, having to work from home, homeschool. Businesses forcibly closed by the secular government. Churches forbidden to meet in person. There's a lot of stress. Coronavirus gone crazy. A good friend of mine here in the spring of 2020, big day, or marriage, or wedding. She had to pare down from 118 to about 12 people. That's pretty sad. People died, but a lot of times they were unable to bury their loved ones. No closure there. Why? Because you couldn't have that many people to gather, even to bury the dead. Has God ignored our prayers? Why is such silence from God? This is part one of two parts of episode on God's silence, or silence of God. Welcome to Reason for Truth, where the truth comes first and reasons come last, but where we're always and constantly learning, because when we stop learning, listen, we stop teaching, or at least stop teaching well. Today's truth is that while it seems that God is silent, it's simply not the case. It's just that most of the time, or all too often, we're just simply not listening. God speaks to us through His Word daily. And He speaks to our hearts and minds, never to our hearts direct, always through our hearts, but through our mind. Listen, God always provides instruction. He's never silent, not for long. If He's silent, it's still an answer, right? It's no. It's just that all too often we're not listening. Today I'm going to address the big elephant in the room, the question, where is God? Is He listening? Why is He silent, if so? The psalmist tells us in Psalm 130, verse 5, I wait for the Lord, my soul waits for the Lord more than watchmen for the morning. More than watchmen for the morning. He repeats that. O Israel, hope in the Lord, for with the Lord there is steadfast love. Remember, God's never silent. It's just that all too often, listen, we're not listening. Again, furthermore, God is never late. He's always on time. It's just that we're all too often early. The psalmist tells us in Psalm 130, verse 5, I wait for the Lord, my soul waits, and in His word I hope. Listen, verse 6 goes on to say a little further, my soul waits for the Lord more than watchmen for the morning. Now, there are two things here that stand out in this psalm. First, the psalmist waits patiently for the Lord. Secondly, the psalmist waits deeply in all his soul. But also, thirdly, the psalmist waits with hope with which he finds. The psalmist uses the words, in His word I hope. In other words, his hope is found in the Word of God. Fourth and lastly, the psalmist says in verse 6 that he waits for the Lord more than the watchman guarding the city, the wall for the morning, okay, the switch of the guard. The watchmen on the wall who guarded the wall were under immense pressure. Think about it. Due to the potential attacks, that's why they were there at night. The lack of sleep, responsibility of the safety for all the men, children, and women there, right? The security of the whole entire city watching that gate. I think many of us here today feel the same way. We're tired, we're weary, we're exhausted by the political, the economic turmoil and strains of life, by the suppression of freedom, I guess. In some cases, can't go to church. And listen, attacks on faith in some cases. Listen, this is one of 7 songs of ascents in the Psalms. There's 7 songs of ascents. There's a whole Reason for Truth podcast or any YouTube on that. You could actually go back and find that episode. We just did it about a week or two ago. But listen, at the end of the day, Psalm 130 is an ascending psalm. It carries the posture of ascending upwards towards God. You and I would be wise to sit still and ascend towards God, praying as if we are ascending towards God and not away from Him. This is a start point for really hearing God and doing away with that silence, or that perceived silence. Listen, there are only 7 verses which lay out for us in this particular this psalm. We're going to use it today as a model by which we can hear God through the silence of waiting on Him. We're going to use other scriptures as well in this 2-part series, but today I want to use Psalm 130 as a basic template for us today in helping us better understand this all too often perception that God is silent. Really, it's not. It's God's silence is often a tribute to His silence, but it's really more or less we're not listening, or at least not listening well. right? In an effort to help us understand God's silence in our life through Psalm 130 and other scripture, let's look at 4 major points to help us understand God's silence in light of our not listening. Number 1, let's start there, is waiting on the Lord. All right, sounds simple. Well, I've been waiting on the Lord, Steve. First, in waiting on the Lord, it's important to note that the psalmist is clear in verses 5 and 6 when he says, I wait, and then he goes on to say, I do hope. See, we need to note that the psalmist repeats these words for a reason. They're important words. When you hear words repeated, there's always emphasis there. And his emphasis here is on the hope is in the Lord, for this was a confident expectation in God who is always faithful to his promises. The psalmist was very confident God was going to answer him. The key here is our waiting on the Lord and accepting the loss of things we have perhaps grown accustomed to. Think for just a moment about what's going on here in culture and the world in general. God has allowed something to happen, right? Perhaps something not to happen. Think about that. Has he or has he not? This gives a reason for us to stop and reflect on what God is doing in our lives, how much of our life is grounded in being with him, studying his word, and serving God and others in his name versus perhaps recreation and fun, materialism and pleasure. I think to some degree, COVID's ushered in kind of a detox from this crazy life of fast pace and a sense of affluency and just, I should say, freedom to do what we want when we want to do it, either with someone else paying the bill or for us working way too hard and neglecting families. I'm just saying that's the good side. There's a lot of bad of what's happened, but that's, I guess, one of the residual goods. So number 1 is, listen, we need to call here to reflect upon ourselves. Before we reflect upon the country, before as well we reflect on the politics of the business. And if we reflect upon ourselves as we read the book of James, we're going to see a lot more about perhaps what we need to change, even in a bad situation, even in a wrongful situation. God's going to use that to bring us to another level of sanctification and maturity in the Lord. This leads us to number 2, which is, listen, the sin of hiding from God and God's mission for our lives is very real. If we decide we want to ignore or hide from God or hide from doing his mission, like Jonah was tried to do, you know how that turned out. I'm not certain that Jonah really ever accepted the mission God gave him, but he did comply. So we want to make sure we're not running from God and pulling a Jonah, but that we want to be obedient so we don't have to pay the consequences of God's realigning us. Now, second, hiding from God or the world's not the solution, as we just said. Listen, we can be cautious, we can be careful, but we cannot hide from what is in front of us and what lies ahead of us. We must face life and pray and trust in God and his provision and will. A good biblical example is when the Lord spoke to Elijah in 1 Kings. Love that. God asked Elijah what he was doing, hiding in a cave, 1 Kings 19, that's chapter 19, and then you could read verses 9 to 18. I like Elijah's response. He says this starting in verse 10. He said, I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and I've killed your prophets with the sword. Even I only am left. They seek my life to take it away. And he, God said, right, go out and stand on the mount before the Lord, and behold, the Lord passed by great and strong wind, tore the mountains, and broke into pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak, wisely enough, and he went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, what are you doing here, Elijah? Like God didn't know, right? Verses 10 to 13. I think it's more of a rhetorical question to have Elijah verbalize to God in honesty what his answer would be. So let's pause for just a minute, though, and reflect on how exactly God speaks. Did God speak through the noise of an earthquake or thunder or fire or the wind that, tore the mountains in half? Listen, no. He spoke through a still whisper. Listen, the next set of verses, which are 14 to 18, God speaks to Elijah now that he has his attention in the quietness. with a still voice. And he has Elijah just standing there quietly, listening in this still of the moment for God's word. Now let's step back and look at the previous verses to see what Elijah was doing before all this. In verses 14 to 18, look back on that again. God first listens to Elijah, who expresses that he's been very jealous for the Lord, which, listen, shows his heart for God. I mean, Elijah wasn't angry with God. He was just expressing probably his pain, his frustration. Elijah was sitting still, waiting for the Lord. Sitting still, waiting for the Lord. Elijah goes into and explains that he's jealous because the people of Israel have forsaken God's covenant, thrown down God's altars, and killed God's true prophets with the sword. And poor Elijah was the last man standing. Why is he jealous? I think he's jealous. He's like, man, everyone else gets a free pass. The bottom line is, I'm the guy, last guy standing here, living in the desert, just trying not to get killed. Why? Because I'm standing on the Lord. Now, can you imagine the last true servant, prophet of God standing all by himself? That had to be a scary, lonely, and a sad place to be in life. Has to be. But then God answers Elijah's prayer with the next step and gives Elijah very specific directions as what to do next in such detail that it could only be of God. Now, just think about this. Elijah's all alone, no friends, no support. God seems silent. The prophets were all killed. Elisha basically has no friends, no co-ministry people to pick him up when he gets knocked down. Sometimes waiting to hear God's instruction or will for your life is a lonely place. Elisha, like us today, is living during a time when Israel and God's people had in great mass turned their backs on God, in part due to the godless leadership of the country. This leads us to a third point, which is that God knows the faithful. And listen, he provides for them. We're going to pick up with this in part 2. God always preserves a remnant. That's going to be the third point. Get that in the next episode. Listen, I want you to think about one question, though, for the next episode in advance. What exactly are you asking of God when you're asking him, don't be silent? Now, I'm not saying specifically like God give you a new car or something, or God give you a job. I want you to think about really what you're asking of God. Think a little more deeply. Go underneath that. Listen, whatever it is, whatever you're waiting on the Lord or you're asking for, are you asking God to bypass your unwillingness to sit silently for him as you work within your own strength? I don't know. I'm not saying you are. Are you waiting for God to grant or answer a prayer that would allow you to hide from God? The unique mission that he perhaps has called you to, because you just listen, it's not a good time for Christians right now. It's time of persecution. Are you willing to do that? Listen, want you to join us. Pick up in part 2 in the next episode. Hope this has been helpful. Pray that you'll grow closer to God and unveil the silence of God, hearing his will and his ways loudly for your life and in your life. Listen, I speak to you from experience. My wife and I used to be dual incomes. And what happened is my wife was an executive at a biotech company. She left to come and homeschool the kids. We lost about 74% of our income. A lot of prayers over the last 10 years in doing so. Listen, it's paid off massively in terms of our investment in our children. But listen, we live in an old house where everything breaks down and we have to wait till we get somebody to fix things. That's the way life is right now. That's okay. It's not the most important thing. As long as things are working, we have water, electricity, right? And we're not that bad off. But the point is, that's a massive hit. And I tell you, I prayed to God many a time, sometimes really kind of bitterly, how am I going to be able to make this happen, pay the bills? And God seems to provide each time. The point is, often my prayer was, I knew kind of academically what I was praying for, but in heart, was I really willing to make the change according to what God's will is versus my will? And we'll touch a little bit more about that in the next episode. Listen, in the interim, God bless you and your trials right now. Hang tight, be in his word, be in prayer. And as always, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. I'll get back to you within a very reasonable amount of time. If you're listening on one of our podcast platforms, please like this, share it with others, tell others. If you're on iTunes, give us 5 stars in iTunes. There's a lot of people out there who just don't like the Christian message. They'll just mark you down for that. If you're watching on YouTube, please give us thumbs up and tell others about us and subscribe. So I don't want to tell you too many things. If you're watching on YouTube, 2 things. Listen, subscribe and smash that little alert bell down there. A little boom, left Sicilian hook. And or as my German friends say, press the clock. Listen, I'll see you guys for the next Reason for Truth episode. In the interim, listen, make it a great start to the new year. Keep your chin up. Keep your eyes in the Word, your heart with God. Listen, be in prayer. God's blessings to you. I'm your host, Stephen Garofalo, and this is your Reason for Truth for today.